Welcome to our 12th, I think already, Humane conversation at the RPA Human AI. My name is Lubisha Metikos. I'll be your host today. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam at the Department of Jurisprudence, Legal Philosophy, as well as the Institute for Information Law. I'll be joined today by Irina, our technical student assistant, who will be helping with all kinds of Zoom-related technicalities, as well as our interviewee, Natali Helberger from the University of Amsterdam. She is a professor at the University of Amsterdam at the Institute for Information Law, and she specializes in AI and law, or AI regulation. We'll be having a presentation done by Natali on the AI Act from the European Commission. Afterwards, I'll be having a short discussion with Natali, posing some interesting questions. And afterwards, the floor will be open for all of your fascinating questions. And that's about it. It'll take about 45 minutes to an hour. And that's the plan for this humane conversation. Maybe you want something to add to that, Natali?
No, I'm looking forward to be here.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll say, can we bring up the PowerPoint and then we'll start the presentation?
Yes. Okay, can you see my slides?
I can, I think. So I think everybody else can as well.
Yeah, perfect. Now, thanks so much joining us on a sunny Friday afternoon to talk about law. And this is a really important issue indeed. So right now, there's a firework of new regulations coming from Brussels, meant to set the framework for the algorithmic society in the decades to come. So only yesterday, the European communities decided on a key piece of this framework, the DMA, the Digital Market Act. Today, I would like to focus on another important regulation in this framework, which is the draft AI Act, or the AI regulation, which can be accepted similar like the GDPR before it, to set the tone for the debate around what responsible AI really means within, but also beyond Europe. It's one of the first attempts worldwide to cut through an increasingly opaque jungle of private and public guidelines, ethics commitments, and user policies. And the Act will formulate binding regulatory standards for what exactly responsible and human-centric AI must mean. As such, the Act will not only be relevant to potential producers, but also to a growing community of scholars. And this is actually what I would like to focus today on you. What the role of researchers is in making all these commitments to responsible innovation meaningful. But before diving into how the AI Act can actually unfold an entire new research agenda, I would like to briefly talk about regulation and maybe also debunk some of often heard concerns, especially from non-lawyers, about regulation. Oops. More laws. Algorithm Watch, the civil society organization, is counting ethical guidelines on AI, and right now the counter is on 167 ethical guidelines. So do we need more rules and regulations and more standards, or is 167 not enough? And is law not actually bad for innovation and program? And is law not notoriously lagging behind technological development? And there's a long and a short answer to this question. And both answers are no. Innovation and technology and law always go hand in hand. The first written law we have dates back to 1718 before Christ, the Code of Hammurabi. And there's a reason for that, why people interact with each other. They need rules to set the rules of the game and to enable them to act peacefully. Maybe now more than ever, in an environment that is on the one hand so much politicized, such as the digital sphere, as we see now also again with the war in Ukraine, but also where we see enormous power shifts from governance to businesses and large technology companies, each setting their own sets of standards of what responsible AI really means. And on the other hand, where we see a generation of consumers that essentially has grown up with dystopian sci-fi movies and ideas of what it happens when the robots come. So there's a reason why we have law, and law has an important societal function to also spur innovation through legal certainty and standardization, especially in an environment where we have so many ethical codes and standards. It's not too hard to agree on ethical values. Who could possibly argue that we do not need transparency or that equality and non-discrimination are important things? But what does that really mean in practice and how to make it work? So law is necessary to make public values concrete and help to operationalize them. It has a critical role in ensuring an equal level playing field. And it's a means to create a condition so that people can actually trust AI, and that AI is not only something we trust in, but it's actually truly trustworthy. So this is why law is not only about a lot of footnotes and small print or man in suit or prohibitions, but it's essentially about society and laying down the rules for society. And exactly that is the goal of the AI regulation, which wants to make rules that should be human-centric so that people can trust that technology is used in a way safe and compliant with the EU, including the respect for fundamental rights. And the goal of the regulation is to lay down harmonized rules for bringing into our society and markets the use of AI systems in the Union. It's a rather ambitious frame. So as the Commission itself markets the AI regulation, it's the first ever legal framework on AI which addresses the risk of AI and positions Europe to play a leading role globally. So what we're seeing here is also some sort of regulatory race for who regulates first. But with these commitments comes also a huge responsibility to get this framework right and make sure it's grounded in a solid understanding of the role of technology in society and how humans and technology interact. The last Humane conversations, we already had a chance to learn something about the AI Act itself, which is why I'm not going to repeat a lot here. But the core of the AI Act is this, on the one hand, very broad definition of what AI systems are. This can be from recommender technologies, automation technologies, emotional recognition technology, and many more. So there's a very broad approach, and it's a risk-based approach. So we distinguish, or that the Act distinguishes between different categories of AI system. There are some systems that are deemed so harmful and full of risk for society, and that present such a great challenges to the realization of fundamental rights, that the Commission suggests that they're simply unacceptable and therefore should be banned, which is in itself quite remarkable because we do not often hear discussions about whether or not to ban certain AI technologies. Examples that the regulation gives are certain uses of psychographic profiling, so using AI systems to identify what your individual vulnerabilities and trigger points are, and use that to subconsciously manipulate and influence you. We see some instances of that, for example, in digital marketing. But also biometrical identification and the famous or infamous social scoring system. So these shall be unacceptable in the European Union. And the gross of the rules in the AI Act about the so-called high-risk systems, that are risk systems which have a potential to form high risk for health and safety and the fundamental rights of Europeans. And here there is a whole catalog of very detailed provisions with regards to data quality and management, the kind of technical documentation and record keeping that builders of these technologies have to observe, extensive transparency rules and rules about human oversight, but also provisions on robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. it's interesting to notice that most of these rules actually focus on the providers of AI systems and not so much on professional or lay users. Then there's a category of moderate risks AI. According to the Commission, very concrete but manageable risks. Examples are the use of AI for chatbots and virtual agents, but also to generate deepfake and in the area of emotion recognition. And here, the AI Act supposes that giving users some transparency about these systems is enough to mitigate any risk those might pose for society. And the largest category of AI applications falls in the low risk category, which are largely left unregulated, at least under this regulation, which does not preclude that other regulations such as the GDPR will continue to apply. So this is the AI Act in a nutshell. And we can look at this act from two perspectives. We can look at it from the perspective of citizens, us using AI technology on a daily basis, each time when we start up our computer or use our mobile phone. And there we can see that what is happening here is an ambitious agenda to create a condition so that, and I quote the AI regulation, we can benefit from new technologies developed and functioning according to European Union values, fundamental rights and principles, the so-called third way. And that is quite remarkable. So AI made and used in the European Union has to observe European values. And there are different approaches to that we can observe elsewhere, like in China and the US. But this is the European approach to AI. So that's the citizen perspective. And then there's the research perspective. As a researcher, I see this emerging framework as a hugely fascinating regulatory experiment and an emergent interdisciplinary research agenda. Not only for legal researchers, but it's also a deeply interdisciplinary research agenda that will unfold on a host of questions of how to implement these rules, what will be the effect of these rules, but also how will these rules affect us as an algorithmic society and set the course in which we're heading. I'll give you just some examples. Take the provisions on interface design, which are very central to the Act. High-risk AI systems shall be designed and developed in a way, including with appropriate interfaces, that they can be effectively overseen by natural persons. So this is this whole idea that we should not have or admit any AI where there's no human oversight, at least not in the high-risk area. And human oversight and these interfaces must then make sure that the human overseeing the AI system can fully understand the capacities and limitations of the system, which is a challenge in itself. But they also, that these humans remain aware of possible tendencies to, for example, automatically relying on these systems or being aware of automation bias. Humans must also be able to correctly interpret the high-risk AI system output and be able to intervene, for example, through a stop button or similar procedure. So all these high normative expectations on what interface design can mean and must mean for the ability of humans to oversight are propped in this Article 14 of the AI regulation, which, if you look at it, will create huge challenges for human-computer interaction design. How to give effect to these interfaces, how to design these interfaces, but also for research into human psychology, into organizational studies, and into economics, ethics, and of course the law. So already a provision like this is raising a host of new interdisciplinary research challenges. Another example, the new right to transparency. As once this act is adopted, you all will have the right to know whether you're interacting with an AI system or a human. So there's a transparency obligation. And especially in relation to the end user, transparency is more or less a cure-all to many, if not most, problems that citizens seem to encounter in a digital world. If you look at this, so providers should ensure that AI systems are designed and developed in a way that natural persons are informed that they're interacting with an AI system. if you dig deeper, you can wonder why transparency, exactly what kind of regulatory goals we want to achieve with that. Is transparency an effective means to achieve these goals? How would you need to inform citizens about the fact that, for example, they are engaging with a virtual agent, and what will be the effect on their behavior, on their behavior, and are these the effects that we intended with the law originally? Again, huge questions that can only be answered with research, actually. And selling transparency as a regulatory response is easy. Making transparency actually work is really hard. And it's scientific research that can make the difference between paper tigers and rules that have teeth and actually achieve the objectives they have been designed for. And last example, we really need research as a critical perspective. If you read through the impact assessment of the AI Act, there are various references to academic research that have, among others, also informed the more overarching question: when is an AI system high risk? And in an annex, the European Commission tries to explain or list some areas of high risk AI. For example, the use of AI in educational settings is there, but also in law enforcement or in biometric identification systems. Other areas are not on the list, for example, the use of AI in media or in social media platforms. And a question that will continues to keep also us researchers busy is: what exactly is an AI system? When is an AI high risk? And is this list complete? Should it be extended, or should other areas or AI systems be added or removed from that list? So there is clearly a role for researchers in getting the AI regulation right through their evidence-based insights, to informing policymakers and helping policymakers to overcome this enormous information asymmetries, because you, of course, all understand how incredibly complex these processes are, not only from the technological perspective, but also the economic implications, the organization, institutional economic, the implications for human behavior and human-computer interactions. Both the Council of Europe as well as the European Commission acknowledge that there is an important role for researchers in bridging these information asymmetries. And do not forget that most policymakers and those writing these rules have not studied technologies or related areas. There's also a really important role for the managerial researcher to signal risks and flaws and regulatory gaps. And also go out there and contribute to consultations and expert hearings or help testing AI applications. And because this is also a university lecture, I think there's also a huge role for the University of Amsterdam. And it's a broad university with a strong commitment to also contributing to society, and a growing community of scholars that do interdisciplinary research in responsible AI. I think we here at the UvA are very well positioned to help getting the AI regulation right. And we already see a number of labs like the Civic AI Lab or the AME Democracy Lab or the ICAI Labs or the Digital Transformation Initiative at the Law Faculty that try to pick up these issues and contribute to our insight what it means to really develop truly responsible AI and how this can inform also the regulatory and governance frameworks. And then there are, of course, other initiatives like the RPA Human AI, which is where we are here today, or Global Digital Cultures or ICDS. And in that context, I also invite you to check out our recent call on AI democratization, which is an important part of this theme. And more generally, there's a lot of attention at the UvA level for this enormous digital transformation that we are going to see as a result of the rollout of AI and digital technology. So to make a long story short, we see an ambitious European regulatory agenda for responsible AI unfolding. And instead of leaning back and observing what is happening and then afterwards complaining that the rules were wrong, I think we as researchers also have a responsibility to help getting these rules right. And doing so is only possible with very solid, rigorous, interdisciplinary research. And I think the growing UFA community around interdisciplinary research in AI is excellently prepared for this. So don't sit there, don't watch, get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Natali, for that very interesting conversation, very interesting presentation. Many interesting call to actions for researchers, for the university as a whole, for policymakers. I have some questions on that. One of the first things that came to mind, that you were talking a lot about the possible points of interest that researchers might have in the AI Act. For example, Article 14 on human oversight. And how such interface provisions or such points of interface between humans and machines might bring up very interesting research questions. And this reminded me of research you've done in the past, actually, for example, on tracking walls on the GDPR, on what consent means, what free consent means, in which you rely also quite heavily on empirical research. And I was thinking, what is your opinion on the role of legal sociological, legal psychological research in adding to this regulation to make it more, less a paper tiger, as you called it, and more actual strong legislation that can work with human psychology and human interactions with machines?
Yeah, thank you. And that's an excellent example, because especially in this area about induced by the GDPR on consent and informed consent and giving people information, I think we can see how big also the discrepancy is of what we find on paper and what the reality is. I mean, this idea that if you give consumers enough information, they will make the right privacy choices. A host of research in psychology, in communication science, and in law and economics has taught us very clearly over the past years that this is not the way it works. And there's some really interesting research projects, for example, also at the UFA, that find out that not only people do not read these policies, but sometimes they don't even see the they don't perceive them visually. And these are insights that are urgently needed, because if we do not take them into account, we're going to build an entire consumer protection framework on completely unfounded assumption, and thereby defeating the, in principle, good intentions of the regulatory framework. And I think that is a very, very important lecture, and has also, for example, already been picked up by regulators. If you look at the recent guidance on the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, there's very clear language that simply dumping a lot of information on consumers in unreadable small print privacy policies is not the way to go, but essentially concerns an unfair commercial practice. But that's, of course, also one of the challenges to infuse all these insights into the policy-making process. And this is something that we have to work for. We have to work for quite hard, actually.
Yeah, I know. There's tons of different policy issues that are very relevant here, especially with the point you made about automation bias and human oversight. That is something that I see quite a lot recently in research, that policymakers and even judges might presuppose that human review might be enough, or human oversight of AI might be enough to prevent fundamental rights abuse. But the actual empirical research shows a whole different side of this story, which breaks a lot of our presumptions on what human interaction might be with a machine. I was also thinking, you already discussed certain very interesting provisions on what risk should an AI system belong to, how should transparency look like, what is the research that we could do for on human oversight. But are there any other provisions besides those that you think that researchers at the UFA and outside of the UFA should focus on, and which might form very interesting points of research or interest for us?
Yes.
Yeah, quite a lot, I think.
as I say, you can read this act as a regulation, or you can read it as an entire research agenda unfolding there. And I think there are many examples of that, also depending the discipline you are in there. Another interesting example is this ban on using AI to manipulate people, to persuade them, digital persuasion, to use their profiles to influence the way they think and take decisions, which is reality right now, which is one application of AI that we encounter on a daily basis. And there are the ban that the Commission defines at the moment is super narrow, and I really have trouble finding real examples of where it would apply. But I think it raises a very fundamental questions of how to think about the impact of these technologies on users, and also the kind of vulnerabilities they create, and who the digital vulnerables really are. And in the law, we have this standard assumption that the vulnerables are elderly, kids, and lunatics. But maybe in the digital environment, we all are vulnerable. And or maybe those who are young or middle-aged and use the internet savagely are even more vulnerable because of the immense digital footprint they leave. And I think these are questions about the relationship, the power relationship between technology and the way it's used in humans, that we urgently need to research to understand what is really high-risk AI, what are AI applications that we're not willing to accept as a society, and where should we be less concerned. And I think that is a discussion we need, and that is a discussion that will not be concluded once the act is adopted. It will only start then.
Yeah, there are many vague or open norms and many presumptions that us as legal researchers should really try to tackle and deconstruct together. But one issue that might arise when we as legal researchers or AI researchers in general might have with this AI, or when researching AI, is that there is no exemption for researchers in the liability or the applicability of the AI Act. So like the GDPR has Article 89, that is an exemption for academics, but such a clear article is missing in the AI Act. Do you see any problems arising from that? Practical problems, liability problems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And also, I mean, remember what I said about this increasingly important role of researchers, which is also more and more acknowledged in Europe, and which is not at all reflected in the AI regulation. If research is really so important in getting the rules right, and I think we need a very fundamental discussion of what do researchers need to fulfill this role. And this is something the AI Act has not thought about at all. And there are various aspects to that. I mean, researchers themselves and universities, they are building AI applications. They sometimes build them also with in cooperation with other media, with other companies. And the first basic question is, if we, in the course of our research, build these AI applications, are we providers in the sense of the law, which the implication that all the provision apply to us? And is that then proportionate? Can we comply with the same rules and same requirements than Microsoft or Amazon and the big technology providers? And that will be a very tricky question. If you look at the definition of who falls under the provision, it's mostly users who build AI to bring it out on the market. But of course, especially in AI, we see a lot of private-public corporations, and many of these labs are building AI together with companies, and of course with the idea of commercializing and putting out these systems on the market. And I think this is something that we will need to look into, what that means then for researchers. Another question is, of course, I mean, if we want to do all this research about the effects of these interfaces on humans and how these systems affect society, we will need access to data, for example, about this. And interestingly enough, the commission, the recitals mention also how important having access to data and high quality data sets is. But as you already point out, this is only a recital which has no legally binding form. It's not more to inform the interpretation, and there's no exception for that, which is also why the LERU responded to the proposal and demanded for very clear carve-outs and research exceptions for academics and research. And I think this is something we also need to talk about, what we need.
Would you share my worry that without such an exemption, without such specific provisions for academics, there might be a chilling effect on AI research and AI research collaborations between public and private sectors?
That's an interesting question. I think some are more aware of the existence of the rules than others. And in this case, the ignorant will be less chilled than those who have actually made their way through reading all this. But of course, it can have chilling effects, especially if I mean, there are very serious fines attached to non-compliance of these rules, and probably, I mean, the likelihood that NRRs will impose high fines on academic institutions are not that high. But still, I mean, already now legal prohibitions, but also terms of use, strongly influence what we can research and what we can't research, and clearly this has also chilling effects.
Yeah, that can be still quite over restrictive then. But on the other hand, we do have now a new sandbox provision for experimentation with AI. Are you satisfied with that provision? Do you think that can help AI development by academics, by AI researchers, or is it still not perfect?
Ask a legal researcher if a provision is perfect, and imagine the answer you get. Well, it is good. It is an interesting approach. This sandbox idea, or the regulatory sandboxes, usually we know these sandboxes from computer security research, so that we have this controlled environment where a technology can be built and tested. And the idea of the regulatory sandboxes expands this idea and calls for a controlled environment in which we can also observe the effects of regulation or the regulatory needs of particular technologies. And the way the sandbox provision right now is formulated is mainly addressed at policymakers and regulatory authorities and ministries, but researchers obviously could play a role here. And already in the Netherlands, there are some of these sandbox emerging. At the moment, the provision is very limited. I mean, there is not a sufficiently clear carve out for liability. I mean, if you're in a controlled environment, ideally you should also have, this should be reflected in the liabilities that you have for the effects of the systems. And at the moment, these sandboxes can be only set up for a narrow defined category of objectives. So for example, doing research in the effect on democracy is not part of these objectives yet, which doesn't mean that we can take the sandbox idea and develop it further also as a methodology, which is something that we also intend to do here at the UvA. And this way, create a mechanism so that we can critically question new AI applications for their ethical, legal, and society implications before unleashing them on society. And I think this is a very potentially powerful tool.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a very useful tool as well for AI development, but still many things can be improved. If I remember correctly, in the sandbox provision, it even clearly states that liability regimes fully apply, explicitly state that. So that also diminishes a bit of the power of such sandbox provisions.
Yeah.
There's also some very interesting questions I've been seeing in the chat. We might also open up to those then, I think. The first question is by Freya. Freya, would you maybe like to respond live and state your question? If you want, you can unmute yourself on the button below in Zoom. We can't hear you, Freya. At least I can.
Or maybe Freya wants you to read it out.
Yeah, I'll read it out then. Freya asked, I was wondering if you think policymakers are sufficiently aware of not knowing the unknown. How do we improve the impact in society of the knowledge we gain within academia?
Yeah, Freya, that is an excellent question. It's a really difficult question also. And I think that is something that we academics, of course, are also very aware of, or not only what we know, but also how much we do not know. And I'm a bit skeptical if policymakers sufficiently are aware of all the unknown, which has also to do with the way, of course, policymakers operate, and which is why it's so important also for academics and researchers that think about these issues from different perspectives, make policymakers aware of everything they do not know, and that's quite a bit. So the question of how we improve the impact in society with the knowledge we gain in academia, I think that will be a very important one. The VRR, the organization that advises the Dutch government on various issues, has issued an excellent report on the impact of AI on society, and especially highlighting also this point that we need new ways of infusing academic knowledge and research knowledge into the policy-making process. And we see some developments here in the Netherlands that might help us to at least know to whom to speak about to. For example, this new creation of a digital staatssecretaris, so that we have at least someone to reach out to. But I think that is one of the major challenges, seeing that the complexity of these issues, we need to create new platforms and new modes of interacting between research and policy without politicizing research, something that we saw also, of course, during the COVID pandemic, where researchers had a really huge societal role in informing with insights and their research. But we also saw that this sometimes backfired and was also abused by policymakers to justify decisions in ways that were not supported by academic evidence, or where researchers were exposed to public debates in very harmful ways. So I think organizing the proper knowledge transfer between academia and policy making in these high complex tech areas is crucial, and one of the big challenges we are facing. Sorry, long answer, but big problem.
A very good point you made also. I think that we should reach out to politicians without becoming polarized and politicized ourselves, which is of course a very tight rope to walk on, I think. The next question was by, let me see, Vanya. Vanya, would you like to take your question and elaborate a bit on it?
Thank you so much, and thank you for this excellent presentation. I'm Vanya Škorić. I'm actually a PhD candidate at the Civic AI Lab, and I work on this intersection of law and policy and AI development. I was wondering, coming back to your point on the impact on end users and different groups that are at risk of harm, to me, the actual act and the mechanisms for the fundamental rights protection that are proposed in it are actually failing to really accord this protection. So, and especially the whole architecture is being built to accommodate the risk-based approach only. So treating it in a very technical and administrative management kind of system for risks. Whereas we know from the legal and practical requirements in the EU fundamental rights legislation, some substantive and procedural parts include interference with rights, but within the clear principles of proportionality, necessity, having an independent oversight, and so on. So here, the proposed conformity assessment for only high-risk AI systems really falls short. So one of the ways that I'm concretely researching, and we as also a part of the civil society that I work with are proposing, is a mandatory fundamental rights impact assessment. So what would be your view on enhancing actually this ex ante part of the mandatory requirements for all AI systems to include fundamental rights impact assessment? Thank you.
Thank you. And it sounds like fascinating research that you're doing. So I would love to learn more about that. And I think it's also part of what these conversations are or should be about, to learn more about what everybody else is doing here at HIFA. And that's a really interesting point. I mean, and we see, of course, this instrument of impact assessment in the GDPR on privacy impact assessment has actually proven quite successful in making companies using AI think about the possible privacy implications and think those through. And I agree with you that we need to incentivize this process and create procedural safeguards that this is actually happening. And actually, I also share your concern about this very narrow risk-based approach, because to some extent, this is a very minimalistic way of looking at fundamental rights. As long as there are no blatant violations of fundamental rights, we are fine. This is essentially what it's signaling, right? Whereas we could also take it the other way around and think much more proactively, how can we implement these technologies that they not only do not no harm, but that they contribute to the realization of fundamental rights and reinforce fundamental rights. And maybe impact assessments could be one tool to get us and companies think more critically of how to use AI for human rights and fundamental values. Very interesting. I think that's would merit an entire conversation in its own, the impact assessment question.
That's I don't see any more questions.
No, me not either.
Oh, okay.
But if you still have more questions, or I mean, you know where to find me. Just Google my name, which is also AI, of course. And happy to hear what you're doing in this area.
Well, one other question I might have personally on from the perspective of a policymaker. There is a lot of different opinions on AI regulation. There is also sometimes conflicting views. For example, on transparency and explainability, there are multiple strains of thought on what is or isn't possible, or what is or isn't included in the law. Or for example, when it comes to filter bubbles, that's also been a hot topic. Do they exist? Do they don't exist? There are different views on this. So one interesting question might be for you, how should policymakers approach researchers when there is so much different research going on that's sometimes also contradictory?
Can you repeat the question?
So there's sometimes also conflict on what AI regulation should be between AI researchers. There's not always one clear answer for policymakers to pick up from the shelves, from the academic shelves. So how should policymakers deal with that, with policy issues that need addressing, but at the same time are not yet completely resolved in academic debate?
Really good, and another very difficult question. I mean, you could argue that if research in academia is still not out on a particular topic, then this might be an indication also for policymakers that maybe it's not the right time to regulate, or regulate in a way that is agile and that can respond to new advances in research. For example, in another piece of EU regulation, the political micro-targeting regulation, there is a very explicit paragraph saying that the regulation should be adapted in response to progress in scientific research and the most recent scientific insights. And I think there's ways of more agile regulating and regulating in a way that leaves room for incorporating the latest insights of research. I think this is something that we will need to see more and more in the future, because of the pace of technology and because of the importance of getting regulations that actually observe recent insights.
Yeah, regulators should be more flexible and avoid stagnation, both in their own insight as well as the actual laws they're creating.
Yeah, and if you see, I mean, take the e-commerce directive. We haven't dared to touch it for many years because it was so difficult to adopt. And MENA, so e-commerce directive, which is essentially regulating platforms or not regulating platforms because of the huge liability exemptions, and which was not up to date with the role that digital platforms have in our society today. And it took years before we decided to open up the regulation and adapt it. So in that respect, we also need to rethink our policy processes to be more responsive.
That should really be improved. Okay, it was very interesting. If there's no more questions, at least from the audience, I think it was a very interesting conversation on many different AI topics. And many interesting call to actions for researchers at the UvA and outside of the UvA as well. I want to thank Natali for joining us today. I want to thank Irina for dealing with all the technical issues, and also for Freya and Vanya for their very insightful and interesting questions. I'll be seeing you for the next conversation. And thank you all for joining.